Today we have Mr. Thomas Byrne, the new president of the Korea Society and formerly the regional manager for Asia Pacific and Middle East region of the Moody's Investor Services, a global credit rating company. Mr. Byrne, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much.
I hear that you are here this time because you were invited to participate in an event by the Institute for Global Economics. Could you tell us what the event is about?
Sure, yeah. No, Dr. Sagong-il, whom I've known a while now, both working at Moody's, particularly during the financial crisis here, but also before that working at the Institute of International Finance in Washington. I knew him and knew of him, of his work. So he decided to invite me to his institute to give a talk. I have to admit that I was a bit surprised as well as honored because I thought it would be an informal conversation. It was a little bit formal. So he had the idea of, he wanted, since I have a long perspective on the Korean economy, he wanted to hear my thoughts, the things that I looked at when I look at the Korean economy. Any economy is very complex, so people focus on different features. He was interested in the features that I look at. He also was interested in my new job as president of the Korea Society because he thinks the Korea Society plays an important role in helping to build the relationship between the peoples of Korea and the peoples of the United States. And he's also intrigued by the board of the Korea Society would like to build on the foundation that we have, but to add more of a focus on economics and business as well. And so he was attracted to that aspect of my new role as president of the Korea Society.
Yes, you are the new president of the Korea Society, right. And I understand that former presidents of the society were mostly government officials and especially the U.S. ambassadors
That's
to
right, yeah.
Korea. So, and you're actually the first one who is an economist who have worked at private company.
Right.
So what's it feel like? And do you have any special mission or any plans for the society?
Well, they decided to change things up, shake things up a bit. Again, the plan is to continue all the excellent work that the Korea Society has done to date and to build on that with adding in a focus on economics and business. The Korea Society was established in 1957. It is a private organization. It's also nonpartisan. So mission statement of the Korea Society is to strengthen the ties between the peoples of Korea and the United States. And we do this through, more specifically, through increasing awareness, cooperation, and understanding between the two peoples. The Korea Society is a fairly lean staff, but it's done wonderful work. It has a very good foundation, and the board of directors would like to see this foundation built up in certain ways, and one way would be to add more focus, but not necessarily shift the focus, but add more focus to business, economic issues, so that the Korea Society can be a forum where Koreans and Americans, business leaders, policymakers, discuss these issues or present views.
In your career, you worked at Moody's, a major global credit rating company for nearly 20 years. And you've been a keen observer of Korean economy and the world economy as well. So I guess I'd like to ask a question about what's your view on Korea's and the world economy in the future?
Right. Well, first of all, the challenges from the recovery to the global financial crisis have been considerable. So just about every economy is performing subpar, below its potential growth rate, including the Korean economy. That's one thing to say. However, if we take a step back, there are features of the Korean economy now that are much stronger than before 2008, and particularly before 1997. So in my view, the Korean economy is better positioned to face the challenges that come from a weak global economy, or even turmoil from U.S. Fed liftoff on its interest rate policy, continued growth slowdown in China, or whatever unknown surprise the global economy throws up to all of us, which does happen, of course, from time to time.
From 1997 financial crisis, Korean economy has been doing pretty well, relatively speaking,
Oh, yes,
and
definitely,
even
yeah.
with the 2008
Yes.
financial crisis as well.
Right.
So, what is the primary reason for that?
Right. Well, I think some of the reasons are that Korea has improved its institutions. There was a sense of complacency, I think, before the 1997 crisis in the government of Korea, that foreign investors would always invest in Korea because Korea was part of East Asia, and East Asia was a stellar part of the global economy. Well, that doesn't always prove to be the case. And you have to build sound structures. You have to have good companies, good banks. You need a very sound system. The Korean government has improved on its institutional capacity. The Bank of Korea has inflation targeting. It has a financial stability report, financial stability monitoring. It's become very transparent in public sector debt management. In fact, one of the most transparent countries globally. And of course, Korea, I think in part in response to the 1997 crisis, entered into free trade agreements, recognizing that the WTO wasn't doing everything that Korea needed to maintain competitive against other countries. So in 2004, Korea entered its first free trade agreement with Chile. And then subsequent to that, now Korea has, as a share of exports, more free trade agreements than any other country. That could change with TPP, unless Korea joins TPP. But the Korean governmental institutions have made many changes in a positive direction.
Well, one of the things that Korea is concerned currently is the slowdown of Chinese economy.
Yes, yes.
What would be the effect or implications for the Korean economy?
Well, we already see it. It's slower growth. It's slower exports. Our Korean exports are contracting. They have been for a while. However, the whole global economy has weak demand for imports. So even Chinese exports are contracting. This is a big challenge for Korea because China is Korea's largest trading partner, more than the U.S. So Korea will have to make adjustments. As I said before, I think this is one reason why growth has been relatively weak in Korea. When you look at domestic demand, what you spend as a consumer, what businesses spend in investment, Korea can pretty reliably grow at least 2% per annum in real GDP. The rest of the growth would come from exports, and then second round effects, more exports, then more investment, more consumption. So the slowdown in China is is one reason why Korea is probably not growing at its potential growth rate, which is probably around 3.5%.
Well, another thing, or more specifically, what we are concerned about is the depreciation of Chinese currency, yuan. How will that affect Korea's economy?
Well, I think the price competitiveness of exports, Korean exports, whether it's the vis-a-vis the renminbi yuan or the Japanese yen, is really secondary. What Korean exports are primarily driven by global demand, and Korean exports are relatively competitive. They're name brands now. They've moved up the value-added chain. So yes, it does have a negative and adverse effect, but the biggest effect on, I think, Korea's export performance will be overall global demand.
Sounds like it is inevitable to have close relationship between the two economies, and it will be all the more so with the FTA between Korea and China.
Right.
Do you think a lot of things will change with the FTA?
Some things will change. It's not the strongest FTA that Korea has entered into in terms of liberalization. I think the amount of exports that the Korean government estimate would come from an FTA wouldn't turn the overall picture around in terms of export performance. It's not all that much. However, it's certainly better to have it than not to have it. That's the way I look at it.
Do you think with the FTA, China will increase in its investment in Korea?
Actually, that's a question I asked a trade expert who works in Washington, D.C. at the Peterson Institute. It's not all that clear if that will be the case. While merchandise trade between the two countries has skyrocketed since the past 10 years, more than 10 years since China joined the WTO, investment picture has been murky. Some years up, some years down, but it certainly hasn't skyrocketed up as the merchandise trade has.
I see. Again, with the globalization, I think many national economies are busy with calculating the gains and losses or pros and cons of having this kind of multilateral sort of trade agreement.
Yeah.
And right now, Koreans are calculating whether we did a good job or not with the TPP, not joining the TPP currently.
Right.
What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I'm aware of the debate, and however, I think the bottom line is it would be good for Korea. It'd be better for Korea to be in the TPP than not in the TPP. The administration of President Park Geun-hye recognizes that. I think Korea will be at the front of the new entrance to the TPP once the TPP comes into effect. Now, Korea could have had more leverage in forming the TPP, the makeup of the TPP, what it means to each country if it had joined earlier. So that's a missed opportunity on the part of the Korean government. We know that the Korean government was busy with other things, particularly the China FTA. However, Korea, I think, will benefit from joining the TPP, and obviously the government sees things that way, and that's why they will probably position themselves to join the TPP once it comes into effect.
Let's talk about another very important trade partner for Korea, which is the U.S., of course.
Right.
And one of the things that we are concerned about is the interest rate increase, which many people expect will happen before the end of this year.
Yeah.
So how will that affect, and how much will the impact will be on Korean economy?
Well, there will be volatility in capital flows. If we look back at the so-called taper tantrum in 2013, when then Chairman Bernanke in a congressional hearing mentioned that, oh, by the way, the U.S. will probably taper its purchases of bonds. There were net outflows in Korea's equity market at the time, net capital outflows. Now, the general trend is at large inflows. So Korea, every country probably will be affected by this. The issue is to what extent. Now, Korea, as I mentioned in my talk this morning, has built up a considerable buffer to capital flows, particularly debt flows. Korea is now a net creditor to the rest of the world. It has its assets, including equity assets and debt, exceed its liabilities. This is a situation that occurred about a year ago, and it continues to grow this net asset position. So this gives Korea a buffer, plus it's not as vulnerable to capital outflows. It will have less of an effect on systemic stability. The Bank of Korea also has an historically high level of international reserves, so it gives it flexibility in monetary policy by having this high level of international reserves. I think Korea can deal fairly well with these challenges and shocks from the Fed interest rate liftoff. Undoubtedly, there will be effects, but I think Korea can cope with it much better than it could back in 2008.
Well, it's quite comforting to hear that. Koreans are sometimes surprised to hear outside observers say that Korean economy is doing well, whereas we are worried very much about our economy. Yeah. What do you think triggers that kind of worry among Koreans? Why are we so much worried about? Well,
I think one way is that Korea is used to relatively rapid growth rates and continued, and now Korea is facing a situation where it's growing below its potential growth rate. If I said before, potential GDP growth rate is about 3.5%. the Korean economy will probably grow somewhere around 2.5, maybe a little more this year. A lot will depend on whether, well, we're near the end of the year. I think a lot really depends on what happens in China and the U.S. But to reach even 3%, global demand has to be stronger. At any rate, I think the sense of uneasiness in Korea comes from an expectation that the economy should be performing a lot better than it currently is. Mm-hmm. However, in a relative sense, Korea's economy is performing relatively well compared with other advanced economies.
Well, people talk about global economic recession. Right. Could you tell us maybe certain measures that Korea can take, mm-hmm. or any modification of global strategy for the Korean economy?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's doing everything that the authorities have been doing, particularly since the 2008 global crisis. When there are liquidity pressures in the Korean system, mm-hmm. financial system, the authorities move in fairly rapidly through Bank of Korea lending facilities, or even lending facilities from state-owned financial institutions. That's one way. The Korean government has the capacity for fiscal stimulus, although the Korean government also is very mindful of fiscal discipline. One of the strongest areas in the Korean economy, the whole economic system, is the government fiscal system, where Korea has moderate debt and on a technical basis is still running budget surpluses. So Korea has a lot of fiscal space to use in a prudent way. And the Korean officials, the policymakers, have done a pretty good job in that. For example, short-term debt has been reduced since 2008, short-term external debt. That was a big vulnerability in 2008. Liquidity buffers have been built up in the banking system. Capital has been built up in the banking system. Things like that. The government is keeping its powder dry by maintaining debt at a moderate level and keeping the budget in line. So the government has taken many preparatory steps to be in a better position should a shock hit in the future.
Along with lessening vulnerability, mm-hmm. for the Korean economy, another thing that many observers of Korean mm-hmm. economy are talking about is finding a new growth engine. Mm-hmm. Could you mention any possible or potential new growth engines for the economy?
I wish I could. I'd be a very wealthy man. I'd invest in it. Really, that's up to the corporations, the way I look at it. I mean, the government has to provide a healthy environment for corporations to invest, but it's up to the corporations to innovate and to make those investments through research and development, through hiring talent, through being competitive in the international system. So that's really, I think, essentially a question for the corporations.
So you think the private sector should be the spearheading power for finding new growth engine? And
yes.
What's the government's role then?
To enable the private sector to do this, in the words of the Bank of Korea, Governor Lee at the Bank of Korea, to ease the regulatory burden on businesses to increase business activity.
With Korea's own economy struggling, we also expect mm-hmm. that Korea's overseas investment mm-hmm. will be decreasing. Mm-hmm. What's your view on this?
Well, actually, Korea's overseas investment exceeds the inward investment coming into Korea. So Korean companies are setting up plants in emerging markets as well as advanced economies. We see this in the United States too, as well as in China, to tap the domestic market. Again, this is largely if overall economic growth is moderating in emerging markets, advanced economies, the markets where Korea is most interested in, there will be a slowing down of investment. That's only natural. But Korean corporations, as I said before, have been very active in strategically relocating. Fairly recently, I've been working on Vietnam, and really it's the Korean investment that is helping to transform the Vietnamese economy, at least the manufacturing sector in the economy. Samsung's production of its cell phones in Vietnam is the big case in point. Working at Moody's, visited many countries in Southeast Asia. I often went on field trips. They're kind of interesting. You can sit in a government office and talk about economic policy, and you can go out in the field and see a factory. And I've seen Korean industrial plants, Korean shipyards in the Philippines, for example. So I've seen this outward expansion of Korean companies. And so what Korea is doing, it's following what other advanced economies have done. In Japan, there's a lot of outward investment by Japanese companies in foreign economies. We also see this in the US, as well as every other country. So Korean companies are really behaving like companies in other advanced economies in this regard.
Mm-hmm. So Korean economy has been quite agile in adapting to the changes that are happening in the global economy.
I think so. It's one way for a company to remain competitive and also to increase its revenues and bottom line.
So in addition to that agility, what other characteristics do you think Korean economy has in terms of foreign investment? Are there any particular patterns that Korean companies have?
Well, so far it's mainly investing in its manufacturing investment that's going abroad. In contrast, for the U.S., a lot of services investment is very important. Professional services, for example, is important too. At some point, Korea may move up the value-added chain in that area as well.
Let's talk about North Korea. Actually, North Korea has been not only a national security issue for us, but it's also affected Korean economy a lot, and we have to take North Korea into account whenever we think about the future plans for South Korea. And it is expected that North Korea is planning to declare reform and opening at the 7th Communist Party Congress, and that will occur in next May. So what do you think would be the implications? What do you expect from this?
Well, I based on what I see now, I'd be surprised if the North Koreans embark on a genuine reform program along the lines of the reform program that the Chinese Communist Party took in 1978 at the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee Congress. North Korea doesn't have a Deng Xiaoping, for example. North Korea needs leaders who genuinely want economic reform. Back then, the Chinese government prioritized economic reform against all other imperatives of the government. We also, the Chinese system, I think, was as chaotic, if not more chaotic, back then. China had just emerged from the Cultural Revolution. Right. Then North Korea. Now it's hard to say what system was more chaotic and more destructive for people's livelihoods, the North Korean system now or the Chinese system pre-economic reform. However, I don't see this genuine interest that economic reform is the priority. Right now, the Pyongyang policy, it seems to give economic reform parallel status with military development. That wasn't the case in China. Economic reform was the primary policy objective of the government.
I see. So
also, the opening is very crucial because you can't have genuine reform in an economy without opening. So an opening would involve North Korea giving, say, South Korean corporations greater access to industrial zones. North Korea were genuinely interested in reform. I think you would have seen by now the Kaesong industrial complex replicated many times in different parts of North Korea. Or you'd see North Korea approaching the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank for membership. Or you'd see North Korea approaching the World Trade Organization for membership. You don't see any of that. In fact, North Korea will not be a member of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, a founding member, as South Korea is. North Korea has a long way to go for opening. And it could come as a surprise, but I don't see North Korea genuinely interested in making economic development the number one national priority.
At least, do you think this is a positive sign for North Korea or North-South relationship?
Well, it could be a positive sign in the sense that the North Korean economy, for all intents and purposes, has collapsed already. And by allowing greater private sector, private initiative and allowing markets to operate, people's livelihoods will probably improve. However, that does not mean that North Korea has embarked on genuine structural economic reform of the institutions as well as the opening of the economy.
Well, we hear that in North Korea, US dollars or Chinese yuan are preferred over their own currency. Why is that, and what are the implications?
Well, that's a fairly common feature, actually, in many economies even more advanced than North Korea's, called frontier market economies, that are, in terms of economic development, are not as developed as the emerging markets, of course, and then you have the advanced markets. But this is a quite common feature in many economies, where economies with high inflation, a banking system that people can't trust, a government whose policies are undecipherable. People like to hold hard currency. It's a hedge against inflation. If you have hard currency under your mattress, you don't have to worry about going to the bank trying to withdraw your money but not getting it. Many socialist systems have a situation where everybody likes to have hard currency rather than local currency. This was the situation in Vietnam before they embarked upon reform. The legal tender was Vietnamese dong, but everybody in the street would much prefer to get $1 to pay for your meal or whatever service was rendered.
Well, we just mentioned that North Korea doesn't have a leadership like Deng Xiaoping's leadership. But if North Korea wants to have certain kind of economic growth, should they do to do that? Yeah.
Well, you have to reorganize the structure of the economy. You need institutions that could help foster economic growth, both in the government regulatory institutions and the banking system, for example. These take time. You need a government that can deal with outside agents more predictably. Now the feeling is, particularly if North Korea were to get investment, particularly in terms of debt investment, that they would have no intention of repaying the debt back. So there's both hard reforms institutionally and also soft reforms in terms of the attitudes or the dispositions of North Korean policymakers.
With the high level of instability and unpredictability of North Korea, it will be really difficult to forecast what will happen after reunification between North and South. But could you share with your view with us in the domain of economy?
Sure. Well, the way I look at North Korea is very predictable. Has no intention of reforming economically. Okay. So it'd be a big surprise when they have this party Congress, the first time in, I think, many decades, that they announce an economic reform program. That being said, if there were reunification, that's your question, what would be the prospects for North Korea? They'd probably be very good. The bonanza would be realized. However, it would take a lot of time and a lot of work. And it probably would be most effectively done if South Korea takes a leading role in tutoring North Korea and changing the system there. But there's no reason to think that South Korea, right after the war and during the the import substitution industrial policies of Syngman Rhee, South Korea didn't do very well. But yet now South Korea is doing, I would say, exceptionally well. Probably the same could be done in North Korea, but it will take a lot of time and a lot of work, a lot of deep institutional change. But since you are the same people, but probably culturally hardwired the same in some ways, I would think that should North Korea choose to embark on economic reform, that they would probably progress fairly well over time.
Well, it's a good news for North Koreans. So after some painful period of adjustment, it will be a better economy.
perhaps it's probably not a good news for those in the military, because it would mean that
Depends
the
on where you
priority
stand.
would be in economics, not in military.
But will that be a good news for South Koreans as well?
It'd be good news for everybody. It'd be good news for regional stability. It'd be good news for global stability, should North Korea embark on genuine economic reform.
Well, let's talk about the future for Korean economy. At the 2014 Global Financial Conference, you said that Korea's per capita income at purchasing power parity, PPP, will pass that of France by 2018.
Right.
And which will be after the end of the current presidency.
Right.
Do you still think so, and why?
Yes, I think it's a question of when and not if. Of course, you'd have to, this is really a mathematical and arithmetic calculation. If you assume that Korea's nominal GDP growth could be a certain level and France's would be just about half of that, it'd be 2018 or 2019. Now, based on what the IMF, I did this calculation this morning, anticipation, redid it again. Based on IMF forecasts for 2016, I know this is technical, of inflation and real GDP growth, so you get nominal GDP growth for both France and Korea, and you extrapolate that over the next 3 to 4 years, it actually would be 2018 or 2019 where Korea catches up, but then would continue to surpass France. Now, the message is, Korea is actually on a convergence path with the highest level per capita income countries in the world. This is very rare in economic history. Most economies grow and then stagnate. In the middle income level, this is the middle income trap, even more so in the emerging market level and the frontier market level. Very, very difficult. Economic reform is very difficult to sustain over a long period of time. Korea is one of the handful of countries that has managed to do this. Emerging market countries that have managed to do this.
It will be great when it is realized, but this is also an uncharted ocean, so there will be lots of things that we need to resolve.
Right.
So as a long-time observer of Korean economy and Korean society, could you point out maybe one or two positive, really most positive elements in Korean economy?
Korea is very driven to excel, generally speaking. Koreans are too. It's a very competitive education system here. And so Korean economies, Korean companies, would like to be, name brands globally. Koreans generally like to excel at what they do, and so this is certainly a positive feature. Koreans have a good work ethic. All these you're an anthropologist, maybe you could answer this question better than I can.
Actually, they were more than one or two that you just mentioned. I understand that you have had quite a relationship with Korea. In the 1970s, you were a member of the Peace Corps volunteers.
That's
and
right,
you were here for 3 years.
Yes, I was
Could you
here
tell
for
us
3
about
years.
it?
Yes, well, it was a wonderful experience, actually. I lived in the countryside. I was involved in a public health program, a tuberculosis eradication program. I met a lot of wonderful people. It was a challenge at first, but once my Korean language skills reached a certain level, it was very enjoyable. Some of the people I met back then, in fact, my supervisor at one of the health agencies, we're still very good friends. We went out to dinner with very recently. It was a very, very, very rich, enriching experience, I would have to say.
Well, was Korea one of the destinations that you could choose as a Peace Corps volunteer, or was it determined in the beginning?
Well, I'll tell you an honest. It was your choice. It was my choice where to go. And I was a biology major undergraduate. I had interested in East Asia, of course, interested in the world, interested in some other countries in the world, perhaps a little more. And Korea was not on the top of my list of countries to go, but I'm very glad I went to Korea. I thought a more exotic country in Africa or or Nepal. But I'm very glad I came to Korea in hindsight because things I hadn't expected to encounter in Korea, I did. Korea was a country that wanted to advance, that wanted to develop economically. And so that was a very exciting thing to be part of, actually.
Well, it would be even more sort of important that you spent your, you are still young, but your younger years in Korea in the 70s, and you have become a long-time observer and also economist who specialize in this region. So how do you feel, looking over the Korea's change over the years?
Well, some things change and some things don't change. I mean, the basic cultural patterns, who Koreans are, I don't think that has changed. What they have achieved has certainly changed a lot. All the benefits of having a priority on education, building up what the economists would say human capital, have paid off in the case of Korea, paid off very well.
Well, because your viewpoint on Korea's economy and the future of Korea's economy is very sort of trustworthy, even more trustworthy for us, because you were a keen observer and you made sometimes you made negative forecast for the region as well. So when you give us positive forecast, it's all the more believable for all of us.
That's very kind of you. I do know that sometimes you get things right and sometimes you get things wrong. Right. You hope that your batting average is pretty good, though, and you get more things right than wrong. Well, but it is important to have experience. You can't. One of the things I've learned is that you can't look at the world in a theoretical framework. You need the experience in conjunction with the theory to try to understand what will happen next.
So with your leadership, we could expect some increase of the business economic domain in the relationship. What about the young generation of the U.S. and Korea? And is there anything that you would like to achieve during your presidency?
Well, the Korea Society actually has programs, the Young Professional Networks, where it takes Korean Americans and has programs for them to increase awareness of Korea as well as the United States. But it's certainly important to have both younger people and older people involved in all the programs. When we reach out to the university community, and in New York City, there are very good universities. There's a wealth of higher education universities in New York City. This is one area we hope to expand our outreach in. We already have made important ties with the academic communities. We hope to expand that more, and that would include young people too, the students.
I see. I guess that's about time that is given to us for the interview. It's time to wrap up the interview.
Right.
I really appreciate your time out of your busy schedule to be with us and share your views with us. Thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate your interest, and I appreciate your interest in the Korea Society. And if you ever come to New York City, please stop by.
I will. Thank you very much.